Right, so I want to talk about a design pattern called promises. They sort of tie into asynchronous behaviour, and asynchronous behaviour isn't something that we're really used to dealing with in PHP. But yeah, before that, I'm Warren, I work at Radify with Gav. If you didn't hear what Gav said, we're recruiting, but we didn't actually meet Wesley Snipes, we just had dinner in the same restaurant as him. So.
Accountant's number,
That was my joke, you nicked it. So yeah, I want to talk about asynchronous PHP. It's not something we really deal with much at the moment, but Hip Hop, VM and Hack have this async and await pattern, which is a bit weird. It looks a bit like CSPs, if you've ever used those in Go or Clojure. Guzzle is a really popular library at the moment for handling HTTP data sources. That has promises as a pattern in there, and React, which is a library for PHP that allows you to write your own asynchronous code, and React allows you to use callbacks or promises. And PHPSW might have promises, early days yet. But yeah, what are promises? Promises allow you to get away from this whole idea of callback hell. So if you ever had to venture into front-end land and write some JavaScript to maybe fetch some data over HTTP and then do something in the DOM with it, you essentially have to make a request and then specify a function, and that function is called when the operation is complete. So you have a function, I'll just call it step one, you give it some arguments, and then you pass in a function, and this function will get called with the result. And let's imagine that you want to do one thing, take that result, and then do another thing with that result, and then do something with the result of two operations. You end up with this thing where you have one function and a callback, and then another function inside that with a callback, and it just goes on and on, going down further to the right as it goes down. So that gets really messy really quickly. It also gets really messy if you want to do two operations in parallel. So you want to do one thing, and while that's complete, and you want to do another thing, and then when they're both finished, you want to do something else with a combined result. And if you were going to do something in PHP like this, you'd have this really nasty thing where you'd start your two processes, you'd give them some kind of handler function, and you'd keep a count of how many times that function has been called. And when it's called the number of functions that you actually gave it, then you're going to do something, and it's just bananas. So yeah, you don't want to be doing that. The promise is here to solve all these problems. The idea is that you have some kind of asynchronous behaviour in this function called promise me. You give it an argument, and instead of returning a value or anything like that, it actually returns this object called a promise. And a promise has some functions on it like then, otherwise, always. And essentially what that allows you to do is say, do this thing, and when it's finished, call this function with the result. If there was some kind of error, call this function with the error, but whatever you do, clean up, call always afterwards. So it looks a bit like, exception handling, so, try, catch, and finally, which is really nice. It allows you to do really cool stuff. If you're doing this asynchronous behaviour, you want to do your serial calls, you can do something like, you can get your promise and say then, do something with the result, and then you can actually, from within this then function, you can return another promise, and then when this one is finished, you'll then come back out to this level and do something with the result of that call. So what happens is you can have this really long serial chain of asynchronous behaviour, but it just goes straight down instead of going all the way across to the right. It also lets you do parallel calls in a really neat way as well. Let's imagine that you've got your promise me function again. You build an array of these promises and you pass it into this promise all function, and that allows you to say then or catch, like if you had a single promise, but this will be called or fulfilled when all of those promises are complete. And you can also catch, if one of those fails, you can catch that error immediately. You don't have to wait for the final result. So that's incredibly useful as well. So far I've been talking about how we use these promise objects. If you're using something like Guzzle, then you get a promise back anyway, so that's really useful if you're using it in that asynchronous mode. But what if you want to roll your own asynchronous logic and you want to have functions that return promises for other parts of your application to consume? This is where it starts to get a little bit funny, because we don't really have any primitives for handling asynchronous behaviour in PHP at the moment. You're still going to have to use some other kind of library that does all the integration with some kind of extension like libev to do this sort of stuff. But the basic idea is that we have this deferred object. You create a new deferred, you do something, and you're still going to have to use a callback. But when that thing is finally finished, you call the resolve method on that deferred object, and then, but before that, immediately you return the promise that's on that deferred, and it's this promise that gives you those functions like then, otherwise, and always. And so you return that straight away, but at some point in the future, your code's going to come back to this line and resolve that deferred object. So that's just me chatting nonsense mostly. This asynchronous behaviour might come to PHP in the core. It'd be really nice if it did. Promises are a much more powerful way of handling this stuff than callbacks. If you know about promises now, then before you have to write callback code, then you'll probably shave or add a couple of years onto your lifespan. So that's great. But even if you never end up writing asynchronous code, if you're happy in your procedural land, then it's still a really powerful pattern to be aware of. And promises expose some really interesting functional programming concepts, which I can't really get into now, but I'll probably talk about on another day. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.